Today we're going to be talking about impression evidence. Impression evidence is any object or material that have retained characteristics of other objects through direct contact. The way impression evidence is made is when one object is pressed against another material with enough force to leave the impression of that object behind. Examples of impression evidence are shoe prints, tool marks, tire tracks, and bite marks. So any object or material that can retain the characteristics of other objects through direct contact. Oftentimes impression evidence gets left like in dirt or grass or soil or any soft objects like putty or things like that. In order to collect impression evidence, you have to look for both class and individual characteristics. Class characteristics, remember, those are going to be things that put us into groups or categories, whereas individual characteristics is what makes them unique. When you're talking about class characteristics for impression evidence, you're talking about general patterns. Think like on the bottoms of your shoes, like your tread patterns, things like that. Size, you're a size 8, a size 9. Or when you talk about like tool marks, think, is it a hammer or is it a screwdriver? Is it with a screwdriver? Is it a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch? So on and so forth. Those are all going to be class characteristics you're going to want to try to observe. And then the individual characteristics will be unique wear patterns from whatever the object was that is put into the impression evidence. There's two types of methods for collecting impression evidence. A 2D method where you photograph it and then you dust it with powder and lift it. So that would be if you found anything on like a flat surface, you would photograph the area and then you would dust it kind of like you do a fingerprint and lift it. There's also a 3D method that's most common when you're dealing with impression evidence, and that's to photograph it and then do what's called a cast. When you cast a piece of impression evidence, you make a mold of it. Down here at the bottom is an example of a shoe print being casted. So here's the shoe print in question here. They made the cast or the mold, and it's some type of plaster. Oftentimes they come in kits where you just have to kind of mush them together to mix the water and the plaster, and it kind of makes the correct mixture of it, and then you can pour it into your location, and then you have to let it dry, and usually it takes a little while to dry. Sometimes it's usually a couple of hours, and then and then after it's done drying for a couple of hours, when you pull it up, it will look something like this. And so that's the casting method for collecting impression evidence. So there's kind of 4 different types of impression evidence. The first type is what we call bite marks. Bite marks are impression evidence. They oftentimes get left in the victim's skin. That's most of the time where you would find bite marks at. Occasionally at crime scenes they can be in things like styrofoam cups or gum or food, but probably about 90% of the time when you're talking about bite marks, they're left in the victim's skin or on the suspect's skin from the victim, depending. One of the big things for bite marks is to look for saliva and blood, because you could potentially pull a DNA sample from those. In order to match a bite mark, if it's left on the victim, and say the victim is deceased and so you can't ask him about it, they can take a look at the suspect's dental records, okay? Or they can do, if they have the suspect in custody, they can do a mold of the suspect's teeth, and they can compare the mold to the bite marks on the victim, and they can also observe the dental records and see if they're a match. Over here to the right of the screen, this was a bite mark that was on the victim, and you can see they did a mold of the suspect's bite mark, and you can see that it was a match. So you can see these 2 teeth here are off, then you've got a crooked one, and then they go down like this. So you can see that it was a match there. Some things to observe when they're looking at bite marks is whether the bite mark was human or animal. That's kind of important because if it's animal, they're not really going to try to figure out where it came from. The characteristics of the teeth, position, dental work, wear patterns, so on and so forth. And those your dental records or your bite marks are unique characteristics to you. And then the color of the area, how long the bite mark has been there for, right? Is it recent or is it old? And one of the most famous incidences for bite marks is for the notorious serial killer Ted Bundy. He was responsible for an undetermined number, I think it was very, very high, murders between 1973 and 1978. He was finally tied to the murder of Lisa Levy through bite marks he had inflicted on her body. So he had bit her multiple times, and they were able to match it back to his bite mark. And that's how they were able to finally get a conviction for him. The next set of impression evidence that we're going to look at are tire tracks. Tire tracks are often found on accident sites. That's probably the biggest location for tire marks, is they analyze them in accident sites, trying to figure out, did somebody stop here, who was involved, so on and so forth. And then occasionally entry and exit routes of crime scenes as well. When they're looking at tire marks, say it was a hit and run accident or something like that, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to try to determine the class evidence, tread pattern, width and depth of tread, and that will allow them to help narrow down the type of vehicle that they're looking for. Okay, because there's only certain tires that can go on certain vehicles, so on and so forth. And then when they try to individualize it, if they say they are able to say, okay, this is a 2005 Ford Escape is what we're looking for. If they find it, they find their suspect. If there's any unique wear patterns or specific damage or defects, that's going to individualize it back to that 2005 Ford Escape versus somebody else. Unique wear patterns, you've got, say, a nail in the bottom of your tire, or your tires are balding all on kind of one side in one location because your alignment's out of shape, so on and so forth. Those are the types of things that can individualize tire marks. There's two different ways that they can kind of try to analyze them. The tire itself, they can do what's called an ink print. So they basically take a paint roller, like what you would roll paint on your walls with, and they'll roll it over the tire with ink, and then they'll roll the tire over white paper, and then they'll photograph it, and they'll compare those to what they found at their crime scene. Or they can, if they have the track, they can do a plaster cast of the track. They can pour plaster into the actual track that's left behind, say if it's in dirt or anything like that, and make a mold of it similar to what we watched in the shoe mold previously, and then they would photograph it. There is a database that has the brands and models of tires, which leads to the vehicles it's used on. So there is the database that kind of can help narrow that down for investigators. The next type of impression evidence is shoe prints. For shoe prints, it's probably one of the biggest ones that they take a look at as far as crime scenes go. Any type of shoe prints that are left behind at the crime scene, they can analyze and see if they can find matches for. Class evidence that you're looking for shoe prints are the type of shoe, whether it is a running shoe, a work boot, a high-heeled shoe, the brand of shoe, Nike, Adidas, so on and so forth, and then the size, right? An 8, a 9, so on and so forth. So if they can narrow down the class evidence, that gives them a pretty good idea of the type of shoe. Is it men's shoe, women's shoe? Usually that's based on size, so on and so forth. To individualize a shoe print, they have to find some type of unique wear pattern or defect in the shoe, and sometimes that's hard to do. So lots of times all they end up getting is class evidence. In order to individualize a shoe back to a specific person, there has to be some type of wear pattern. So like if you look at the bottom of your shoes and they're, all the heel is rubbed off and none of that's left, that's a unique wear pattern to your shoe. That's going to look different to somebody else. But if they don't find any individual characteristics, then it would just be considered class evidence. So specific features to analyze: the tread patterns, the size and the depth of the tread themselves. Wear patterns, the way the person walks, heel to toe, toe to heel. It'll be kind of deeper in different areas. Material defects, okay, these are going to be your individual characteristics, right? Nicks, cuts, etc. And then they'll also take a look for trace material, any unique soils, rocks, paint, anything that's found in the impression that might be able to be, tied back to the actual shoe if they were to find it. There is a database to determine the brand of the shoe based on tread patterns. So anytime a shoe is made by a manufacturer, it gets uploaded into the database so that they can kind of help narrow down, this is a Nike running shoe, this model, so on and so forth. And they can also estimate a person's speed, walking versus running, as well as a person's size based on the depth of the impression. But that is just an estimation based on kind of what they can see. The last type of impression evidence is tool marks. A lot of times we'll find tool mark impressions left behind at breaking and entering crimes. There are other situations in which they're present, but that's a lot of times where they'll find them. People trying to get into or out of houses or areas or different things like that, and they're trying to use tools to bust open the window or the door or anything like that. You're looking for defects or patterns that are left on the tool when it's made, or wear patterns or damages within the tool left behind in the impression. So say, for example, you have a hammer that you've used for a whole bunch of years and there's a chip out of the left kind of side of it. That would be a unique characteristics, a wear pattern that you would want to look for so that you were able to individualize it back to the impression that was made. Class characteristics for tool marks when you're looking: the type of tool that it is it a hammer, is it a screwdriver, what type of tool, the size of it and the shape of it, and then we kind of already talked about this. Individual characteristics are unique wear patterns within the tool. Tool marks are kind of classified in two different ways: impressions and scratches. Okay, so impressions are when the tool hits a softer surface and leaves the shape of the tool and any imperfections in the surface. So like if you were to take a hammer and hit a piece of wood, it would leave the impression of the hammer in the wood. That would be impression evidence. Scratches are when the tool moves across the surface and leaves ridges or striations behind, and those ridges or striations can be unique to specific tools if they have any indentations or impressions in them as well. Here's some examples of how tool mark impressions work. So you can see you have hammer A here and you have hammer B, and both of them were used to hit a piece of wood over here. Okay, and you can tell that this matches hammer A right here. So here's the chip or the nick that is in hammer A, and you can see that it left the impression in the evidence over here. It left an indentation there. And then here's another example. These are pliers. Okay, and you can see here's the impression that was left in the wood. Both of these are impressions, not scratches. Okay, and then here's A and B, and you can see that it matches B because of the scratches in B. They get left behind as ridges right there. So just a couple of examples to kind of show you for tool marks. So those are the four types of impression evidence, okay? Bite marks, shoe prints, tire marks, and tool marks.